Okay, and we're live, and I just wanted to do a video on Surah 90, which is entitled Al-Balad, or the city. And the theme of this surah is the trouble that you have to endure if you're a Muslim specifically, but the fact that the world is a place of struggle. And this is ironic for a number of reasons when you put in the context of the Quran and Islam and Islam's origins. But it begins again with Allah swearing, "Nay, I swear by this city, and you shall be made free from obligation in this city, and the begetter and whom he begot. Certainly we have created man to be in distress." And this is interesting because in Islam there's no concept of original sin. The idea that man is in in a state of breach, the relationship between man and God has been severed, and it needs to be restored. He needs to be reconciled because of his sin. This is a concept that's completely foreign to Islam. And it's one of those things when you think about it, it undermines the entire religion, and it undermines the whole idea of dawah, of going out and propagating Islam, trying to get people to convert, or as they would say, revert to being Muslims. Because if man is born innately good, and that's what Muslims believe, that and this is why they say you revert to Islam, because everyone is born innately good, and they simply need to return to accepting Islam. But the thing is, why would they need to return to Islam if they were born good? If there's no imputed sin, if there's no if there's no um, if there's no separation between man and God, why would they need this religion in the first place? Why would they need to do anything in order to appease Allah or God? When looking at the framework that Islam has established, if there's no original sin, then what's the point? What's the point of the five pillars of doing zakah and performing the Hajj? What's the basis for any of these rituals in Islam of trying to appease Allah? And why does Allah condemn people to hell if there is no imputed sin? It doesn't make any sense. So when he says here, we have created man to be in distress. What does he mean exactly? Why is the world why is man in distress if the world is not fallen, if the fall didn't occur? And you can see this in the Quran. Iblis, or Satan, he he tempts man, but unlike in Genesis, he's not exiled from the garden, and Satan is not cursed. In Genesis, God God curses him. And in fact, this is one of the many prophetic verses that alludes to the coming of Christ, the fact that woman will bear a child that will bruise, or Satan will bruise his heel, but he will bruise his head. She will bruise his head. That's this is the prophetic. This is the prophecy that's going to come once the first advent happens. Once Christ comes, and is resurrected, Satan's plan is foiled. But the thing is that that's completely absent from Islam. So you have to ask yourself, do you, uh, why would man be in distress? Why would there be a world that's hi GW? Why would there be a world where man is struggling and where he has to where he's constantly in turmoil? It doesn't make any sense if you accept the premises of Islam. So in 5 it says, "Does he think that no one has power over him? He shall say, I have wasted much wealth. Does he think that no one sees him? Have we not given him 2 eyes and a tongue and 2 lips, and pointed out to him the 2 conspicuous ways? But he would not attempt the uphill road. And what will make you comprehend what the uphill road is?" And one of the funny things, there's a there uh well, there are a number of commentaries on this surah, but one of them is by Sayyid Qutb, and he was one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and the inspiration, excuse me, the inspiration for not only Osama bin Laden, but nearly every modern jihadist. Islambuli, the one who assassinated Anwar Sadat. All of the contemporary jihadist movements take their inspiration, at least the Sunni ones, from Sayyid Qutb. And there was a great book written about his philosophy in the aftermath of 9/11, called Terror and Liberalism by Paul Berman. And he goes into Qutb's philosophy. And he was his idea was to return the Muslim world to the time of Muhammad. And this is a bugaboo among Muslims. They think that Muhammad and the Rashidun Caliphate, the 4 caliphs who inherited Muhammad's empire in Arabia and expanded upon it, they think that was these are the halcyon days of Islam, and that all the problems facing the Muslim world are the result of abandoning Islam, and they need to return to the time of Muhammad. And this was one of Qutb's chief ideas, even though he wasn't the only, and he certainly wasn't the first to invoke this, but it was a popular idea, particularly in the 20th century, when the Islamic world was seen as in decline. Its borders were receding, and it was being conquered by Western European powers. And he was also a Quranic scholar, and he published a number of books interpreting the Quran. One of them was In the Shade of the Quran, and probably one of his most famous books. And he also published a number of commentaries, and his commentary on this surah is interesting, to say the least, because he says nowhere else can you find a a a description of a precise description of the natural world, and I'm paraphrasing here, done so vividly and poetically as you can find in the Quran. It doesn't exist. You can't find a scientific explanation as wonderful as the Quran, as what you find in the Quran. And it's hilarious when you actually think of the science that the Quran teaches. And if you're going to base your scientific knowledge on the Quran, you would, I mean, you would be woefully ignorant. Plus, the other component of this, the idea that this is majestic or beautiful in a poetic sense, is ridiculous. The Quran is one of the most tedious, repetitive books you'll ever encounter, and it's not repetitive in a poetic sense, this metronomic kind of pounding the same phrases over and over again. It's not done for the purpose of achieving poetry. It's just, I mean, this is what the Quran is. It's just an endless, tedious repetition of the same phrases, many of which make no sense whatsoever. So this is what you find here when he's describing, but it is something that you find in the Quran. This description of the natural world as a way of attesting to the divinity of Allah, and it really is. Um, it really doesn't make sense when you think about it, because there's no evidence offered that this is Allah's doing rather than the God described in the Bible. So in 13 it says, it is the setting, and this is what he's saying the uphill road is. It is the setting free of a slave, or the giving of food in a day of hunger, to an orphan having relationship, or to the poor man lying in the dust. Then he is of those who believe and charge one another to show patience, and charge one another to show compassion. And Muslims will use verse cherry picked verses like this to prove that Muhammad really was a man of peace and a diplomat and a liberator. But when you look at it, the fact that he mentioned setting free a slave, that's not evidence that Muhammad was a compassionate person. Muhammad freed one slave in his lifetime, Bilal, an African slave. I think there was also another slave who was raised in his household who was ultimately freed. But you basically have one or two slaves that were freed as a result of Muhammad. Contrast that with the innumerable number of slaves you find who were taken into captivity because of Muhammad, not just personally, and he had numerous slaves, many of them not just not just African slaves taken to do labor, but female female captives who were taken into sex slavery. And this is something that Mohammed's known for throughout the world. Outside of the Muslim world, people would associate him with having sex slaves. I mean, that would be one of the main things they would associate him with. So he himself personally had, at a minimum, dozens of slaves. But add to that the fact that he sanctioned slavery in the Quran itself. So he encouraged slavery that expanded throughout the known world at the time, throughout Asia and Africa, Europe, and there were slave raids as far away as Rome and Northern Europe by Muslim pirates. So, and the number of slaves that died in the Islamic overland routes, it was just astronomical. There were more slaves that died being taken from Africa to Muslim lands than died in the transatlantic slave trade. So, I mean, people are aware of the fact that the transatlantic slave trade was um, incalculably brutal, but the fact is, the Islamic slave trade was even more brutal and more barbaric, and it's not the numbers of victims were an order of magnitude higher than that. We don't even know how many died because they were buried in the sands, and they weren't calculated. They were treated like property, and just but yeah, the Islamic slave trade, uh, from the Ottomans, from the Arabs, um, on through the Ottoman Empire, enslaved tens of millions, and more slaves died at their hands than died during the transatlantic slave trade. So the idea that you can take a verse saying, well, uh, this is the uphill road, the setting free of a slave, that's nice. But if you actually look at Muhammad's record, he was a slaver. I mean, that's one of the things he was notorious for, being a slave or owning and selling African slaves. So it continues in verse 17. Then he is of those who believe and charge one another to show patience and charge one another to show compassion. These are the people of the right hand. And ironically, the right hand, that's also something repeatedly used in the Quran to refer to sex slaves, who those whom your right hand possesses. So the right hand is supposed to be an indication of nobility and compassion, but but it's really an indication of slavery, which is the hallmark of Islam. In 19, it says, and as for those who disbelieve in our communications, they are the people of the left hand. So they are the evil ones, the ones that don't want to embrace a religion of slavery and servitude and bondage, ironically. But it ends on verse 20. On them is fire closed over. So again, this is just more threats used to try to create a docile, pliable people subject to Muhammad's whim. And the sad part is, it's still working. Uh, a millennium and a half later, in large parts of the world, people are still blinded and really captive to this book. It's very disturbing, but thankfully there are actual translations now, and there's the internet. People can find, if they really want to find the truth, they can search it out and see what this book says, and what the hadith say, and how it gives the lie to Islam. Anyway, that is Surah 90, and the next Surah is the Sun, Shams, and I'll be doing that in my next video. Thanks, everyone.